Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club and Happy New Year. My name is Josh Harrison, President of Improving. I'm also proud to serve as the Vice Chair of your CMC Board of Trustees. Thank you to today's forum sponsors, Fifth Third Bank, the Robert Weiler Company, the United Way of Central Ohio, Ian Alexander Photography, and the Columbus Partnership. Thank you to our gracious host, the Ellis, for its generous support. Let's give a round of applause for our sponsors. We're also grateful to the Center for Human Kindness at the Columbus Foundation and the Columbus Dispatch for presenting our live stream, being carried right now on CMC's social media platforms. Let's thank everyone for today's support. Welcome to today's forum, our first of the new year and a very long-standing CMC tradition and my personal favorite forum of the year, the Blue Chip Economic Forecast. Today we'll hear what the year ahead looks like for Central Ohio's economy from our expert panel, plus we'll be the first to hear the 25th annual official release of the Regionomics Columbus Economic Forecast. To introduce our esteemed panel, please help me welcome Payman Salahi, Managing Director of Private Wealth Management with today's sponsor, Fifth Third Bank. Payman, welcome.
He's slightly taller than me. Welcome, everyone. Happy New Year. It's always a pleasure coming here. This is our 10th year sponsoring this event, and we do it because it's important. Yes, we're a large financial organization that works with wealthy families to help them on their voyage with their money. We manage $58 billion in assets. We have our own economists, but sometimes the global economy is always important to see and understand, but knowing the local economy is extremely important to our clients, to our business owners, to our real estate professionals, to the people who live here. And the balance that this event has to be able to look at that and hopefully have some great insight for the year to come is important. It's important to see what's happening at a local level, and this organization and this event does that really well. So it's our honor to be here. Thanks again. I'll go and introduce our esteemed panel as it was presented. Ben Ayers, Senior Economist for Nationwide Insurance, in the middle there. Dr. Joyce Chen, Associate Professor, Department of Economics, Ohio State University, and the fabulous shoes that she's got on today. And in his 23rd year, if I'm not mistaken, the people most of you come to see. You don't come to see me, for sure. But Dr. Bill Lafayette is also here as a panel member. And to kick us off, I'll let Bill have some words, and then we'll start with the panel. But before we do that, I also want to introduce Mark Williams from the Business Reporter, Columbus Dispatch, who's been offering us fantastic insight and great articles for many, many years. So welcome. Bill, take it away. It's all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Payman, and thank you all for being here. Good to see some good friends, familiar faces. For those of you streaming now or later, thank you for tuning in. Thanks to our sponsors, and a big thanks to my friends at CMC for making this forecast the first forum of the year now for 23 years, which makes me officially old. 2024 actually marks my 25th annual forecast of the Central Ohio economy. For its first years, it was sponsored by the Columbus Chamber, my then employer. When I went out on my own, I took the forecast with me. Given that milestone, I certainly wish this year's news could be better. although I guess it could be worse. The forecast is for employment growth of 9,800, or 0.9%, in our 10-county metropolitan area. You may remember that when I brought out last year's forecast, I brought along a barrel full of asterisks. The uncertainty surrounding the economy this time last year was far, far greater than usual. Last year, I guessed at a net gain of 10,300 jobs, or 0.9%. As of now, it looks like we got a gain of 10,300 jobs, or 0.9%. Sometimes you just get lucky. In any case, that gain was not good at all. The U.S. gain this past year was 2.3%. So if our growth had been merely average, we would have gained not 10,300 jobs, but more than 26,000. We underperformed even the state, which gained 1.8%. And the same is true of the gain that I'm predicting for this year. For the third consecutive year, it looks like we're going to fall short of the national average. And that brings me very briefly to the U.S. economy in 2024. Ben will have much more to say about this. There are two surveys of national level forecasts that I follow, one from the Philadelphia Federal Reserve and the other from the National Association for Business Economics. The employment change projections of the economists in those surveys imply a year-over-year gain of 1.4 to 1.5%. Most economists responding to these surveys expect growth to slow quite a lot in 2024 as the Federal Reserve's interest rate increases come home to roost. Will this be enough of a slowdown to bring on a recession? Some say yes, but many say no. But any recession is likely to be much, much milder than the last two were. But that leaves a big question hanging. Why has our employment growth been so lackluster? This is not something that we're used to, at least recently. Between the end of 2009 and February 2020, the Columbus metro area gained 23.4% in employment, while the U.S. gained 17.5%. But we don't always outperform. Between mid-2003 and the beginning of 2008, our growth was 1/3 slower than average. The problem back then was an overbuilt retail sector that collapsed. The problem now is workforce availability, a point that I brought up here last year. Central Ohio's 2023 labor force is up less than 0.5% from 2022. We are using up all our workers. Our unemployment rate was barely above 3% for most of the year. We're facing a double whammy: the wave of retirements from the aging population and much slower population growth. The impact of the silver tsunami on the labor force is not news. The Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission projects that the working age population 18 to 64 will be growing around 0.8% per year until it picks up after 2030. And that's taking the Intel impact into account. What may be news is the weakness of our total population growth. Between 2010 and 2020, the Columbus metro area grew more than 235,000, average growth of 1.2% per year, 70% faster than the national average. Between 2020 and 2022, we slowed to less than 0.5% per year, which actually was still faster than average. Another troubling fact is this: although net migration from foreign countries is holding its own, More than 1,400 more people moved out of Central Ohio for domestic destinations between 2020 and 2022 than moved in from domestic origins. We can hope that the slowdown in population growth is a temporary impact of the pandemic, but our region's shift from a big net importer of population from domestic origins to a net exporter to domestic destinations is really, really troubling. We don't know anything about these folks and where they're moving to, but one very likely cause was the impact of the housing market. That's where I want to go next. And Doug, chart number 1. What you're seeing here is the Federal Housing Finance Authority's quarterly house price index for the Columbus metro area in blue and the U.S. in black. This chart begins in 2012 when house prices started increasing after the recession. For the first few years, house price growth here was less than the national average, as it had been during the past decade. But then beginning in 2016, prices here started increasing faster than average. Since 2016, prices nationwide are up 79%. Here, they're up 93%, almost double. Rents are up too. Since 2012, rents in Franklin County have increased 20% after inflation compared to 15% nationally. It's quite possible that people have been leaving the area and others haven't moved in because they can't afford to live here. The problem is one that's been discussed on this stage before, and I'm sure will be discussed on this stage again: a lack of housing development. Chart 2, Doug, please. This chart compares the estimated net increase in houses and apartment units in blue to the increase in households in black since 2001. I'm measuring the increase in housing units from building permits, less my estimate of units lost from the stock each year, around 2,500 annually. By definition, each household has to have a housing unit. So the shortfall prior to 2020 must have been satisfied by occupying formerly vacant units. That includes rehabbing boarded up units. And that's exactly what happened. The overall vacancy rate in the Columbus MSA fell from 10.7% in 2010 to 6.6% in 2022. Notice that the housing unit increase picked up in 2020 just as household growth slowed. But it turns out that these bigger increases in housing units still aren't enough. If they were, there would be an increase in the vacancy rate to more normal levels. That would indicate a loosening of the market. But there's been no significant change in the vacancy rate since 2019. The increases, without including losses from the stock, have been around 11,000 units per year since 2020. In contrast, the increases in the early 2000s, as you can see, topped out at 16,000 per year, with a population more than 20% smaller than it is now. My work with the MORPSI household growth projections suggests that we need to be building that same 15,000 to 16,000 units now. If we don't increase the number of new housing units soon, houses and apartments, price and rent increases will continue, we won't get the population growth that we need, and our current subpar employment growth will continue. I'm very much encouraged, though, that housing is on everybody's mind these days. That certainly does imply that we're going to get this sorted out. Obviously, the sooner, the better. Thanks again for being here in person or virtually. I wish you all a happy, healthy, prosperous 2024. Mark, we are in your hands.
Bill, thank you for that delightful forecast. Happy New Year, everyone. Thanks to Bill and the CMC for having me back to moderate this year's conversation. This is always a lot of fun for me, and I look forward to it every year. And welcome to our new panelists today, Joyce, along with Ben, who's been on our panel before. Both will add great insights to our conversation today. And I can't speak for Bill about this, but frankly, I'm thrilled that we have panelists who have hair. And Payman, thank you for the kind words. I've got to tell you, I've been called a lot of things over the years. Esteemed is not one of them. And just for transparency, okay. Just for transparency, I did a story on Payman and his family a decade ago. It was a good story to do. These are interesting times for us, for we as reporters at the Dispatch and our sister paper in Newark. We have so many big projects that we're covering every day, whether it's projects that will really change our life, I think, in our community, whether it's Intel or Google or other projects in Licking County or the electric vehicle battery plant that Honda and LG are building in Jeffersonville, or the billions being spent by hospitals in our region. All of this poses major questions about how we as a region will handle all the growth that's coming at us, especially given the workforce and housing issues that Bill has raised in his remarks. Before we can think about 24, I think we need to have a quick review of 23, including giving Bill kudos for hitting the mark from last year's estimate. That's no easy task. If you recall, when we were all together a year ago, the outlook was rather dour. The Federal Reserve was in the middle of an aggressive series of rate hikes that, by most predictions, was going to drive the economy into recession. Inflation was roaring, and the price of eggs was approaching $5 a dozen. If you had told me then how things would in fact turn out in 23, I would have suggested that you were an early adopter of the state's liberalized marijuana laws. The U.S. economy added a solid 2.6 million jobs in 23. Ohio added a robust 110,000 jobs and broke its all-time jobs record. And this is despite what we're seeing in Columbus, where our job growth has been the stock market has roared back to life, and inflation is seemingly on its heels. So now we're into 24, and it looks like another tricky year ahead. Instead of interest rate hikes, we're now talking about rate cuts as soon as this spring. Job creation's clearly slowing. We'll learn more on Friday when the next jobs report is released. And while the economy has held up so far, we know that there are plenty of folks struggling in Columbus and elsewhere with the cost of housing, child care, and health care. I'm sure some of you have seen the recent reports that the number of people saying that they're homeless rose 12% last year nationwide to the highest level since records have been kept since 2007. With that, Joyce, let's kick it off with you as the new person on our panel. We've heard Bill outline his concerns about housing and the impact it's having on jobs in our economy. Can you drill down for us on those issues of housing insecurity and how that's affecting our economy? And beyond that, are there solutions of things we could be looking at to address this issue?
Thanks so much, Mark. Before I start, I just want to thank CMC leadership and organizers for inviting me to join this long-standing and illustrious panel. I think as we continue to see disconnects between consumer sentiment and macroeconomic indicators, it's really important to have a diverse set of voices at the table so that we can understand what's happening from Wall Street's perspective and from Main Street's perspective. So I'm really excited to be here. Also, one quick point of clarification. I am pleased to share that I am now a professor at The Ohio State University and also affiliated with Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. Thank you. So to tackle Mark's question, I think housing is so central, right? It's really the cornerstone of how people build their livelihoods. So housing insecurity is going to translate into labor market insecurity, whether that's labor force participation or labor force attachment, which tells us how much and sort of how frequently people are working, right? Those who actually alluding to, to what had been discussed earlier with housing prices. We know that growth in housing prices, and Columbus is not unique here, has been exceeding growth in median income. Growth in rents has been exceeding growth in wages. And Columbus, compared to other comparable cities, has seen the largest increase in housing insecurity over the last 15 years, with a 20% increase just in 2022 alone. Right? So that housing insecurity, it really dovetails with other forms of financial insecurity, right? And so those folks are at greater risk for missing shifts at work, losing jobs, and then potentially falling into a downward spiral and becoming unhoused. And that's something that can be very hard to stop and turn around, right? And in fact, we're seeing this play out in real time in Columbus now with the Colonial Village apartments, right? Hundreds of folks displaced from their homes on short notice. And while they're getting assistance from the city with relocation, right, they're not getting paid time off to pack up their lives, move their things, unpack again, right? They're not getting, or they're being displaced from their social networks and their family networks who provide childcare or elder care. They're getting displaced from transportation networks, whether it's the parking spot that they had, or the bus route that they're on, or the ability to walk to work, right? Or a carpool or ride share that they had in place. Right, so this is the vicious cycle that we see created by housing insecurity, right, where people, it's really hard to break out of, and it's preventing people from fully investing in themselves, in their skills, in their jobs, in their families, in their schools, and in their communities. So creating affordable housing is something that's going to allow folks who are already here to participate more fully in the labor market and the economy, as well as attracting outside folks and outside businesses to come to the region. And the last thing I want to mention, right, is that this is not just a construction or zoning issue, right? This is also a consumer protection issue, again, as we're seeing with Colonial Village, right? This is, and I know the City of Columbus is already looking into this, right? But this is about putting in the right regulations and enforcing them so that we protect consumers from negligent property managers, absentee landlords, right? And protect home buyers from predatory pricing by wholesalers, by private equity funds, and by institutional real estate investors.
So Joyce, you touched on a number of key issues there, and you mentioned some of the consumer protection things that can be done. Are there other things that the city should be looking at, or the state should be looking at, beyond some of the housing issues that have already, some of the housing programs that have been created?
Yeah, I mean, of course, housing insecurity is also rooted in lots of, is an equity issue, right? So it's rooted in patterns of systemic racism, in mass incarceration, and in intergenerational wealth disparities, right? So to the extent, I think, of course, those are kind of long-standing issues and large-scale policies, but to the extent that the city and Columbus State, Ohio State University can help address and mitigate some of those factors, I think that will also help to address some of these housing issues.
So let's get Ben in the game here. We've had solid job growth over the past year. Inflation's down, gasoline prices are down, and people are still spending money, yet we are consumers just flat out grouchy. There's no question about it. Despite evidence to the contrary, we think inflation is getting worse, not better. And we want prices to go back. And inflation going down is not enough. We want prices to go back to where they were before the pandemic. Is there a way to explain why we are in such a foul mood? And outside of the Browns winning the Super Bowl, can anything make us happy?
I would cheer for the Browns to win, for sure. But.
Of course, this all comes in the context of what you're looking for in 24 and the forecast for what you think is going to happen.
Yeah, I think to me, I look at it, and I still think it's an inflation story. You know, this is something that we haven't seen for 40 plus years. Many folks, this is the first time they've seen inflation like this, and for some folks it's been 40 years, and they remember what it was like and how it stuck around, and something they're concerned is going to stick with us as we go forward. And more than that, it's something that we face every day. You know, you go to the grocery store, you go to the gas pump, you go to Walmart to pick up your household items, everything's more expensive. And when you see your income's not going up quite as much, you feel like you're falling behind. And you factor in interest rates as well. Obviously, those are up sharply. We've talked about housing a lot. You know, you talk about mortgage rates at one point we're almost up to 8%. You know, a lot of people have locked in lower mortgages, but if you're looking for that home, it's very expensive. And not only are prices going up, but now interest rates are very high. So I think about what's happened with inflation over the past couple of years, what's happening with interest rates right now, and it's still at that very elevated level. I guess that's enough to probably make anyone a little grouchy as we think about where the economy is sitting and where we think it might go over the next couple of years. I would say when we look at 2024, I think we do see some positive news as we look out over the next year. We are seeing inflation is fading. Obviously, inflation peaked, at least from the Consumer Price Index, peaked about 9% in the middle of 2022. We've come all the way down to the 3 to 3.5% range on a year-over-year basis, so not back quite to where the Fed wants it to be, and certainly not seeing really much of any reduction in prices. I think that's unlikely to happen. But we are getting back to more normal trends and points where inflation has slowed enough that incomes are keeping up. We look at something what we call real income growth, which is adjusted for inflation, and that was actually positive for most of the months over the second half of 2023. So it's not going to happen overnight. You're not going to feel like you're catching up with those price increases right away, but we are seeing that start to happen, especially as we expect to see inflation fade further over 2024. I think by the end of next year, we'll see inflation maybe 3%, a little bit lower, and particularly when we get into 2025, expecting inflation to settle in that 2 to 2.5% range, where the Fed would like it to be. Yet again, that's still a ways away. That means some pain in the meantime. Again, that means prices are still going up, but maybe just not as quickly. And hopefully if income growth maintains at current levels or still pretty solid pace, then people can catch up. They can get ahead of this, feel like they're back more in control. And obviously we do expect to see interest rates come down as well. As we look out over the year, we do expect the Fed to lower rates. And they might be a bit delayed. I think the markets are pricing it in the spring. We think they're probably not going to lower rates until May to June, and maybe more in the second half of the year. And even then, they're probably not going to drop it quite as sharply as we've seen the Fed do in prior cycles. But still, we're expecting to see some relief, again, both on the inflation front and in interest rates as we look out over 2024. I think that's the good news. The bad news is it might coincide with a mild recession. This is typically what we see from the business cycle, what we see from the economy. The Fed raises rates, it cuts things back, we see credit conditions tighten up, and ultimately you do see that recession. So when I look out over 2024, and there's a lot of optimism that maybe we can achieve what we call a soft landing, we don't actually see a recession, we sort of land the plane and then take back off, I think it's more likely that we will see a mild recession than we will see a soft landing over 2024. But there's really just a bit of nuance there. It's not the fine line between a soft landing and a mild recession. I think either way, you're talking about a slowdown for the economy, things cutting back, demand slowing, inflation slowing, probably some job losses, but we think it's pretty well capped. We see the unemployment rate only rising to about 4.5% to 5%. That's not very high. It's higher than where we've been. It eases things up a little bit from the labor market perspective, but hopefully won't mean as much pain, and hopefully just a resetting of the price environment and get back to more of the more stable growth that we've grown accustomed to over the past couple of decades.
Yeah, Ben, just to follow up on that, I think when people hear the word recession, it's kind of like, oh my God, the world's coming to an end. Because we think of recessions, we think of what happened early on in the pandemic, we think of the great financial crisis from 15 years ago or so, and I think that's what people remember as recessions, not the ones we more typically have had historically.
Yeah, I think there's a huge amount of recency bias, unfortunately, that, you hear the word recession, you're thinking 2007, 2008, you're thinking 2020, and the reality is these are more, unfortunately, 1 in 50, 1 in 100-year events that happen back to back. Most recessions are pretty mild. We usually see GDP contract for about 2 to 3 quarters, and we see the unemployment rate rise maybe 1 to 2%. Again, kind of resetting, hopefully, the inflationary environment, getting back to more normal trends. I think that's, again, still our baseline as we look out over the next year. We're thinking something more like a 2001 recession, something more like a 1990-91 recession. So, not impactful, but still things that aren't calamitous economic events that are really cascade and have a big impact on most folks. In fact, most folks, I think, might not even notice it much, except for maybe some disruptions to their stock market returns, disruptions to their 401k, but they ride through this and see things better on the other side.
So, Bill, we joked about marijuana earlier, but legalization, it does create an issue for employers, especially given the tight labor market that we still are in. I've talked to manufacturers that are very, very concerned about the ability to make the ability to find workers and wondering what they're going to be able to do to keep their workplaces safe with the liberalization of the marijuana laws. How much tougher does this make it on employers to find workers?
I suppose it depends on the type of work you're doing. Like, if you're operating a manufacturing plant or if you're operating a warehouse and somebody shows up to work stoned and drives a forklift, people can die. Obviously, that creates huge liability issues for the employer. In a more clerical setting, I think the impact would be less. I do think, though, that you'll see employers regulating people coming to work stoned in the same way they regulate people coming to work drunk. In most cases, people will have the common sense not to come to work stoned out of their gourd. Yeah, it will make it harder to hire and harder to retain employees, no doubt about it.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the standard response to all that is that, workers are using marijuana anyway. And one of the big problems with this is testing. When you test somebody, you don't know when they last consumed or used marijuana. It just seems like it's going to be tricky for employers, especially some that are going to continue to be hardline. And if you fail a drug test, they're not going to give you a job, even for something that it may be legal.
Well, I have a feeling that that rule's probably going to go out the window, at least for marijuana, just because of the shortage of workers. About 2005, 2006, just for grins, I simulated the impact of a recession in 2021 on the labor force and labor availability, 2015, I should say. And the labor force situation improved. It was not cured. And the minute the recession ended, we were right back into trouble. So I have a feeling that employers are going to have to adapt to the new reality.
So, Joyce, as a professor, you've expressed concerns about Senate Bill 83 that would restrict diversity training on college campuses in Ohio. More than ever, we're counting on people like you to train in the next generation of workers that the state's going to need for all the projects that we have coming on board. Just talk a little bit about the proposal and what concerns you about 83.
Yeah, definitely. So we're certainly seeing already challenges in hiring new faculty and in recruiting students to the university, particularly those who are engaged in the humanities. And I think it's also important for us to remember that the humanities actually are a very important part of a college education, right? And that, in fact, as I think we'll get to, with the advent of AI, that training in humanities becomes more important in a lot of ways. And so we want to be cautious about diminishing those departments and diminishing the faculty in those spaces. Changes to potentially to the tenure system also have faculty very concerned, and so we may be seeing some, and I've heard from friends and colleagues, desire to look at opportunities in other states where they're not facing the same kinds of backlash from the state legislature.
My concern about doing away with diversity on college campuses is just the impact on the students. I think about the students, for example, in the business college at Ohio State. If they don't get the kind of diversity training that has been offered before, they're not going to be in a good position to deal with the market, which is diverse and becoming more diverse every day. And so I think of Senate Bill 83 as sort of burying their head in the sand. I I hope it doesn't become law.
So I'm getting a high sign here that it's we're ready to move to questions from the live stream and you folks here today in person. If you have a question, please make your way over to the microphone now. If you're watching online, please type your questions into the chat. Before we take audience questions, I have one more question for our one more topic for our panelists before we get to our audience. So economic growth was surprisingly strong over the summer, defying all expectations. Do you know what else was going on over the summer? Was Taylor Swift's tour. Hosting one of these concerts is basically the equivalent of hosting a Super Bowl in your city. I've seen one estimate that each show generated $93 million in economic activity in terms of tickets, travel, merchandise, hotel, and outfits. Add it all up, and the Eras tour generated $5.7 billion in economic activity from Swifties. Obviously, it's difficult to look at one particular event and see its role in the context of our giant entire economy. But I was hoping our panelists could just talk a little bit about travel and our need to continue to get out and do stuff after the pandemic and how that kind of is filtering through the economy. And I guess bottom line on it is, are we done, or do we still have enough juice left to go into 24 to carry us on a little bit?
Well, as long as Taylor keeps traveling, I guess we'll be okay. If Taylor were to come to Columbus, I actually don't know whether she did or not. Not that I dislike Taylor, I just can't afford a ticket. But if you pay hundreds and hundreds of dollars to go see Taylor, if you live in Central Ohio and do that, what you're doing is you're taking money away from other consumption activities that you would have spent. You're sending hundreds of dollars out of the economy. And you're eating meals that you would have eaten anyway. The benefit comes in from all the people from Mansfield and Dayton and Hamilton and so forth who come into town. Those folks are bringing new dollars into the economy, and they benefit not only the providers of those meals, they benefit their suppliers, and they benefit their employees. And so there's this ripple effect that economists like to talk about that is very, very real. So it would be a nice thing for Columbus, no doubt.
Yeah, I mean, just broadening that out to the wider U.S. economy, I think that the spending on services was really one of the main reasons behind the resiliency that we saw from the U.S. economy over 2023. We only have data through the third quarter, but particularly services spending added about 1 to 1.5% to GDP growth for each of those quarters over the first 3 periods of 2023. So a lot of extra, whatever you want to call it, COVID revenge, still going out and spending services because we couldn't for so long. So a lot of extra spending that really helps support growth, because really about 2/3 of economic growth is tied to the consumer. And as we continue to spend, we're still going to see those positive numbers. Now, shifting it to 2024, I do have a little bit of concern, though, that maybe we're at the end of the road from much of this spending activity. There's a lot of excess pandemic savings that was saved up either because of the checks we got in our bank accounts from the government or just because we weren't spending as much. Most estimates say those are all gone. For most consumers, all of their pandemic extra savings is gone. Credit card debt is unfortunately at record levels. If you look across the economy, over $1 trillion in total credit card debt across the economy. That tells me that people are kind of running at the end of the run when it comes to spending, and that's one of the main reasons why our forecast and most other economists do expect things to slow down next year, whether it is a soft landing, hard landing. Hard to tell at this point, but are expecting a bit of a pullback from the consumer as we look out over 2024.
So I have a little bit of a different take. The summer, right, was also the summer of Beyonce and Barbie. And so I see that trifecta actually as being a harbinger of sort of some of the demographic shifts that we're going to be seeing in our economy moving forward, right? lower rates of marriage, later age at first marriage, lower fertility rates, right? We're seeing women emerge as a much stronger consumer group. We're seeing markets focus more clearly on women as a consumer group. And so I think that's going to be where actually we're going to see growth, even separate from sort of travel and entertainment.
Toto, 3-dog night and AJR this year, so we're doing our bit to uphold the economy.
I can't top that. I'm sorry. Of course, it's CMC's longstanding tradition to take audience questions. Mantras in the back, curating questions from our live stream audience. For those of you with us in person, please join her at the microphone. Of course, you all know the rules. Keep the questions brief, and remember that questions do end with a question mark. Mantra, what is our first question?
Yes, thank you. And I was the one that did pay for a Beyonce ticket to go to her concert. So yes, thank you, Joyce. And it was incredible. All right. First question is from Bob James. He says, my property tax has increased 43%. Assuming I am not the only one, how will that impact consumer spending, retail employment, et cetera?
Well, taxes are taxes, and that is bound to redirect spending that would have been made otherwise. We actually got a tax decrease, which surprised the heck out of me. But the problem then becomes if you don't raise enough taxes to provide services, then your roads get worse than they are, and your children don't get educated, and all sorts of bad things happen. Like I always say, if we want nice things, we have to pay for them.
Anybody else want to take a shot at that? Now, I mean, I know the question is right on because my property tax bill went up a lot this year after reappraisal in where I live in Fairfield County, and I know that there's been efforts to try to cap this, but a lot of this is tied to the point that Bill and Joyce have been making regarding the rise in property values. So much of it is tied to that, and so I'm not sure we want I'm not sure we want that in reverse. So it's hard. Next question.
Good afternoon. Thank you to all of our panelists. Candace Klepaz. One of the things I heard this afternoon is that housing is kind of the linchpin that we're all talking about. And I am a member or a resident of the Near East area, and two things that we have seen in our area that I'm assuming we're seeing in other places is we have a variety of properties that are owned and continue to be owned but remain vacant. And then another component of that is short-term rentals. So my question is from a state or local or even national level, what are some options that we have to disincentivize abandoned properties and have the correct balance between short-term rentals and the necessary housing that we have for our communities? Thank you.
Joyce, that sounds like a question for you.
Maybe a little bit outside my wheelhouse, but I know Columbus City Council is already looking into potential regulation, I think, relating to wholesalers and finding other ways to ensure that properties are getting into the hands of actual homeowners for owner-occupied housing, as opposed to for broader real estate investments. I think on the question of short-term rentals is a bit more complicated, right? That's another great way for the city to generate tourism revenue and to make visiting the city more accessible and affordable for folks, and also for people to generate a second source of income, right, or a supplemental source of income. So there, I think we want to be mindful of both how folks are utilizing that to generate income and also how it affects tourism in the city.
Next question.
Okay, this is a shameless plug, but speaking of housing, we will be having a forum next week talking about what would it take to end homelessness in Columbus. So you go ahead and register for that one. That'd be great. All right, next question. Actually, it's on my phone, sorry. Not to touch the proverbial third rail here, but there's an election coming up. What do the markets think will happen? Which outcome in the likely presidential race might benefit the economy more?
Well,
I'm told I'm getting punted towards that one.
but are we talking like the economy or stock markets or? What, the economy? Yeah.
The economy. Yeah, I mean, I guess when you look at long-term, it's easy to say it doesn't matter because when you look out over the long term, no matter who wins elections, I feel like the more important factor for us is always the Fed. The Fed is really probably the main driver of the cyclical nature of the cycle. When they're raising rates, they're actively trying to slow down the economy, and we ultimately see usually the economy go into a recession. When they're lowering rates, you're going to see more activity. You're going to see more expansion. So what I say about this is I think about the Fed as really determining more of the direction of growth, whereas what happens fiscally and federally is more of a kind of magnitudinal of that. So certainly you've seen these examples where the federal government has stepped in and provided assistance. You think about what happened over the great financial crisis and really prevented the bottom from being deeper than it could be based upon what the Fed was having to do and what was happening with a housing crisis and a financial market crisis. Vice versa, we've seen the fiscal environment be restrictive in other environments and cut off some potential growth from the environment. So when I look out for the next year, I'm still much more honed in on what the Fed is doing. Are they lowering rates? Are they loosening up the credit environment? Are they helping to promote growth? What happens with the federal government? It isn't impactful. It's not nothing, but I think it's more of a, does it help or hurt what the natural cycle is going to do based upon what the Fed is really driving from an interest rate perspective?
Yeah, so when I was a reporter back in the 80s, I used to cover the Jefferson-Jackson dinners and the Lincoln Day banquets, and the state economy and the national economy were both doing pretty well at the time, and the Jefferson-Jackson people would always, credit Dick Celeste, the Democrat governor. Economy's great, it's got to be the Democrats. I go to the Lincoln Day banquet, Ronald Reagan was president. Oh, Reagan's great for the economy. So politicians always get too much credit when things go well and not enough, or get too much blame when things go to hell. So that's kind of my attitude on it as well. Next question.
Hey, good afternoon. We've talked a lot about how.
Always wanted to make a comment.
Please.
Just want to mention, I think we're also starting to see, though, that inequality is impacting economic growth. And so their federal and legislative policies become more important, right? Are we going to see unions continue to be able to make the types of moves that they made in 2023, right? Some really big moves. Or are we going to see a reversal of that? Again, alluding back to housing, right? Are we going to see more equity in housing markets to help grow our labor force? I think those are all dependent on sort of who's in power.
Next question, sorry.
No, that was great. That was actually a great segue into my question, so thank you. So we've talked a lot about how housing, is particularly locally here, is a leading indicator that will kind of drive the rest of the economic activity. And we talked about it in aggregate, just housing stock being a housing stock unit. But in reality, that's not the case. So when I look across, where I live in Dublin or New Albany or, the upper income areas, I actually see a lot of new construction going up. But it feels to me, and I'm wondering whether the data backs this up, that the housing growth we are seeing is in that $500,000 and up housing price points, and we're not adding units at the entry-level home prices. Is that just a bias from where I live, or is that true? Is the data actually support that? And if so, what could we do about that?
The data actually support that. Full disclosure, I'm a member of the board of the Affordable Housing Trust. And we need many units, not only for low-income households. We need many units for what we call worker housing, workforce housing, moderately priced. And that's true, as I said last year, of some of the folks who are going to be working at Intel. We're going to need a fair number of workforce units for them. So yeah, we need more, and it's often said that it's not economically feasible to build lower-priced units, and so there are subsidies available, and they should be expanded.
Okay, next question.
Hi, everyone. I wanted to ask about immigration. Bill touched on it in the beginning, but One of the things that we learned during COVID is that between 25 and 40% of all healthcare workers are immigrants. We tend to think that it's the construction worker, the person on the warehouse, but across the board, some industries depend entirely on immigration. Construction being one, agriculture and the food industry heavily depend on immigration, and yet, when I hear politicians talking about it, there's either rejection or not desire to do anything. We could literally fix that need for workers by improving the immigration system. And I was wondering if someone could, speak to that. We need to change our I'm an immigrant, I'm biased, but we need to just change our attitude about it, period.
Yes. Immigration, fixing the immigration system is very important. I would add that we should stop demonizing immigrants. That is really, really worrisome. A huge percentage of our growth during the last decade was from overseas. And I was actually somewhat surprised to see that holding up in the latest Census Bureau estimates for this region. But I loved it when Governor DeWine the other day said, bring the immigrants here. We need them. We want them. And that kind of speech from the top of the government chain is really important. I'm hoping that it'll make an impact.
Next question.
Eric Krolak with Action for Children. Professor Chen, you spoke about the care economy, the rising price of child care and elder care, and we know that that doesn't break evenly for everyone, that access to the labor force is disproportionately affected by those things that the care economy provides for women, for low-income families, for families black and brown. Could you talk a little bit more as a panel about equitable growth versus growth? And maybe specifically around projects like Intel and other things that capture headlines, but maybe don't get to this issue of equitable growth.
Yeah, so this relates to something else I had wanted to talk about, which is the growing gig economy, particularly in Columbus, as we run so much in terms of logistics, right? And I think it now is a pivotal moment for us to be conscious about how gig workers are treated, how gig jobs are both counted and regulated, right? I know that in Wisconsin they've sued, right, to have Amazon Flex workers who are the sort of on-demand delivery drivers for Amazon, not their paid full-time workers, right? But to have them actually counted as employees, right, as opposed to independent contractors, and have Amazon paying into unemployment funds. And I think factors like that can contribute a lot to equitable growth and holding those kinds of gig economy employers accountable for the gains, really, that they're getting from independent contractors who oftentimes pick up this kind of work specifically because they lack access to childcare, right? And so they need that flexibility. I've even heard actually corporations refer to these as mommy shifts, right? So that women can drop their kids off at school, pick up an Amazon Flex shift, finish it, and then pick up the kids from school, right? And we need that kind of flexibility to come in other forms of jobs as well.
So we have time for one more, and I'm told it needs to be short.
Are you saying I'm short? So thank you very much for
a short question.
It'll be a short question. I'm Amy Claybin with Families Flourish, and I've really appreciated the connection between the economy and housing. Rents are up. We're not adding enough units. Housing insecurity leads to employment insecurity. And what do we do to get more equity in housing? It's not just enough to talk about construction. It takes a long time, and we have so much increasing homelessness that next week that's the conversation. What can we do to think differently about providing rental support So people who are in the workforce who don't make enough money, they're working full-time, they may have other flex-time jobs, and they still don't make enough to afford the rents or to afford a decent place to live. And we don't have enough federal rental support to meet the needs. So what can we do in the, locally or in the state to meet this needs? Thank you.
Let this fact sink in for a minute. 25% of renter households in Central Ohio pay at least half of their income in rent. That should not be happening. Anything more than 30%, you're housing cost burdened. So obviously, many more units are needed. We are behind the 8 ball. We should have started this years ago. There need to be more subsidies. But of course, if we have subsidies in housing, that means that we don't have the money to do other things. And so it's really a public policy, how we're going to subsidize the renter, particularly renter housing market. But we have to, or homelessness will increase along with all the costs and problems that entails. And I would argue that if you looked at it from that perspective, it's a positive net present value project to expand these subsidies. Makes us better off.
This idea might be a little out there, right? But I think we could also look at whether we can convert some of existing apartment buildings into more of a condo type situation, right? Where owner-occupied housing we know has better attachment, people feel more invested. In suburban areas, right, there's a lot of NIMBY where people are concerned about apartments and the sort of volatility in those spaces. If we made it more owner-occupied housing, perhaps that would change that dynamic and help create more stability as well.
Ben, do you have a quick comment?
I mean, I think we just need to do whatever we can to get more housing. I mean, there's a dearth of housing out there more broadly. It's been exacerbated by the current environment where most of the people who have a mortgage are locked in and they don't want to trade up. And anything we can do to boost the housing supply, particularly locally, but more broadly across the country, would really help things out.
The big problems are NIMBY and zoning.
That's it for us. We're going to turn things back over to Josh.
I hope that you enjoyed today's forum. I know I came in here really excited about the growth of Columbus, and now I'm kind of sort of a little bit excited about what could come. In all seriousness, I think with growth comes challenges, and I'm glad that our panel in this room is really thinking deeply about those challenges and how to make our city great, so thank you. Thank you so much to our forum sponsors, Fifth Third Bank, the Robert Weiler Company, the United Way of Central Ohio, Ian Alexander Photography, and the Columbus Partnership. And thank you to the Ellis for its support. We want to thank our virtual seat patrons and the Center for Human Kindness at the Columbus Foundation and the Columbus Dispatch for presenting today's live stream. And our very special appreciation to today's panelists, Ben Ayers, Bill Lafayette, Joyce Chen, and our host, Mark Williams. As Mantra mentioned, please register now to attend next Wednesday's forum, very applicable to what we talked about today. What would it take to end homelessness in Columbus? Thank you again, everyone. We could not do this without you. Have a great afternoon.